Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Nick Mueller and Mr. Ben Mankiewicz.
We are very privileged every day at this museum to have veterans come to visit us, and it is especially important when we have our World War II vets here, so thank you. As many of you know, 2019 marks the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, a day when over 150,000 Allied troops landed by sea and air on the Normandy coast of France, thus changing the outcome of the war and certainly the fate of the world. You may also remember that on the 40th anniversary of this historic invasion, President Ronald Reagan stood on that very spot on the northern coast of France where Allied soldiers had stormed ashore, and he had us all mesmerized as he detailed the chilling story of the American Rangers who had to scale sheer cliffs to take Pointe-du-Hoc from the Germans, who were shooting down on them with machine guns and cutting their ropes. On a cloudy day, on the 6th of June in 1984, President Reagan spoke to a world audience when he told us the story. When one Ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a Ranger would grab another and begin his climb again. They climbed, shot back, and held their footing. Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top. And in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe. 225 Rangers came here. After 2 days of fighting, only 90 could still bear arms. In front of an audience that included World War II veterans who had gathered that day to honor their fallen brothers, President Reagan choked back his own tears as he spoke. These are the boys of Pointe-du-Hoc. As he looked from one veteran to the next sitting in front of him, these are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. It has been almost 75 years since that fateful day in 1944, and almost 35 years since President Reagan honored those men so eloquently. And yet his closing remarks still ring true today. Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their valor, and borne by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged this evening to have with us two gentlemen who take that call to action very seriously. In different formats, of course, but both with their eye towards learning about the people, the place, and the time that changed the world. Many of you may recognize our first honored guest this evening. He is Turner Classic Movies host and film commentator Ben Mankiewicz. He is a former television producer, news reporter, and anchor. He is only the second host that Turner Classic Movies has ever had, and he is here tonight to help us learn about our second guest and his latest project. As luck, or coincidence would have it, Turner Classic Movies and Ben are hosting a 9-week film series beginning next week on May 2nd. Each Thursday in May and June, they will broadcast 3 classic World War II films with intros for each of the films, which were shot on location at the National World War II Museum. Which brings me to our second honored guest this evening and the reason we are here. He is a historian, a teacher, a dean, a vice chancellor, and now a famous author. Most importantly, he is the founding president and CEO of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Dr. Gordon Nick Mueller has written a book entitled Everything We Have, D-Day 6/6/44, and that is what we will hear about tonight. This book is a unique collection of personal accounts and oral histories of those who were there on D-Day, focusing on the time period from midnight to midnight on June 6, 1944. The individual accounts represent all aspects of that day. While most are by American soldiers, sailors, and airmen, one is by a captured German platoon leader, and another by a nurse who treated the wounded and the dying back in England. The words are backed with photos from the battles, as well as artifacts and large-scale maps, some of which have been in the museum since the opening. In Dr. Mueller's own words, quote, "This book is about saving memories of those we should never forget." That's what the museum is about too. I want the reader to come away asking the question, could I have done it like those men did that day? Thank God they did. Ladies and gentlemen, without further delay, please help me to welcome Dr. Gordon Mueller and Mr. Ben Mankiewicz to our stage.
All right, Nick, that was like entirely for you, just so you know, but it was nice to, this is great for me being here at the Reagan Library because I never knew at TCM, we don't know what happened to that guy after he stopped acting, He just vanished, and it turns out he had quite a career after, we just had at the TCM Classic Film Festival 2 weeks ago, and I screened in front of a packed house with Angie Dickinson, The Killers from 1964, which was the president's final movie, where he slaps Angie Dickinson, and she said every time he saw her after that, he would apologize profusely. He did not like to play the heavy, but I thought he was pretty good at it. Anyway, Nick, welcome. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for the help that you gave us last month. That was really great, and I'm looking forward to that series. So basically, how did this begin, the museum, which started as the D-Day Museum? I mean, there aren't many museums as good as this one whose roots are back in the University of New Orleans History Department.
Well, it's a good place to start, and let me also thank the Reagan Library for hosting this event. And those veterans are out there. I know everybody was standing. Just raise your hands one more time so we can see our veterans again. Don't you all stand up? I want to see where they are. All right. There you go. Well, this museum and this book are about their stories. So start with their stories, and it is interesting how this whole thing got started. I mean, it's the screen that you see up there is Steve Ambrose, my best friend of 31 years, passed away in 2002. But the shot that you see of him is with the two of us at the opening of the D-Day Museum, which we were originally on June 6, 2000. And off to the side there is a little gazebo. It was in his backyard, and that's where we had drinks every afternoon at 5 o'clock. So 5 o'clock somewhere was at that little gazebo. It moved off of its location. This was after Katrina, and I went back to take a picture because by now it had become a historic site in 2005. But that was our Hewlett-Packard moment right there, just so you know. Having had too many drinks of sherry, and Steve said, Nick, we've always been wanting to do something for World War II, D-Day. They're never going to do anything up in Washington. He said, so here's my plan. I've got 1,000 oral histories I've taken over the last 5 years of writing my book on D-Day, and I'm going to give those to you. You're starting up a research park at the University of New Orleans, right where Andrew Higgins tested the landing craft. And Eisenhower had told Steve Ambrose in 1968, that's the man, Andrew Higgins, that won World War II because of his boats. And Ambrose just almost fell off of his chair, a young military historian. So he said, well, it's good enough for Ike, and it's good enough for us. We're here. You've got the historic site, and so let's do a small D-Day museum. And I said, that's the best idea you ever had, Steve. He said, good, it's only going to be $1 million. And I said, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, Steve. It's going to be at least $4 million. Oh, God, we could never raise that kind of money. So anyhow, 10 years later, lots of ups and downs, broke a couple times. We opened downtown at $25 million. And so there we were at the grand opening with Steven Spielberg and Hanks and Secretary of Defense Cohen and Tom Brokaw, and 200,000 people, 200,000 on the streets of New Orleans, saying thank you to 80 trucks carrying veterans of all the D-Days of World War II. It was a day to remember. So in any event, it was the stories that inspired the museum, the same stories that inspire this book, Everything We Have. And here we are today, and now it's approaching a $400 million project, and I'm glad our capital campaign chair, Pete Wilson, is here because he's got to raise the rest of the money. This is a history crowd here, so I know that. So this is the place where I always say, who said you can't do anything with a history degree? So couple historians having drinks, and here we are. So that really has to do with the beginning of this idea, and it's really always to tell the stories and save the stories of the veterans. And of course, the 75th anniversary of D-Day was coming up 2 years ago. We thought it was time to do something.
Why the title, Everything We Have?
Well, that came to us because Eisenhower, a couple of weeks before D-Day, everybody was sequestered in the harbors and airborne and getting ready in their air bases. Nobody could leave their bases, and he met with all the generals, and he said the moment was coming. At that time, it was planned for June 5th, and that everybody was ready to go. And he said, this is planned for victory. We're going to go down there and throw everything we have into the battle. Everything we have is what those guys gave on D-Day. Everybody. So we thought it was a fitting title for a book on D-Day.
What were your, what were your motivating factors? Why'd you want to write this book now, other than it obviously being the 75th anniversary?
Well, that of course was a major motivating force. It's the 19th anniversary of the founding of the museum as well, and wanted to do something going back to our roots, to the stories that inspired the museum. But they inspire all of us every day in the museum and throughout the country as we try to appreciate what they did. So that's always motivating, but it's also a way to showcase the museum artifacts and photographs, many of them never before seen. And so that was a way to present. We have the largest collection of oral histories in the world, some 10,000 of them, and about 1,500, I guess, on D-Day. For me, personally, it was also a tribute to Steve Ambrose. And I think, he would have been very proud to have been here at this time and to see what has happened.
Do you have moments strolling through the museum where you think of Steve? You must have them every day.
Almost every day. I kind of pinch myself because going back to the gazebo, we never dreamed of anything. Everybody said, well, you had this vision. We didn't have a big vision. We had a little small vision. But it grew, and people began to gradually, after a lot of false starts, people began to understand the significance of saving the history of World War II, and especially D-Day, which is what we were trying to do at the time. And so this is a big story. And Ambrose was always just amazed that Congress wouldn't do a museum. But look, we're talking about 160,000 troops, 11,000 aircraft, 6,000 ships and boats, all of them moving at the same time over the night of June 5th and 6th. Tremendous, epic, never before happened in human history. All done in secret overnight. The stakes were tremendous, win or lose, and everything was at stake. So I hope the book captures some of that drama, and the artifact on the screen up there is the order of the day that Eisenhower gave to every soldier and sailor and airman. And you can read the artifact facsimile, which we have in the museum, but it says, soldiers, sailor, airmen, you are about to embark on the great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. So everybody knew their mission. it was clear. And this giant armada of ships and men were plowing toward the fortress Europe and Hitler's Atlantic Wall.
What did Eisenhower have in his breast pocket?
Yeah, well, we have a copy of that in the museum as well, because after he'd given the order, let's go, he was worried. There were a lot of things that had to go right for it to succeed, and we'll talk about some of those, but he wrote his press release basically saying that the invasion was a failure and the fault is all mine, that our men did everything humanly possible. And so it was something he hand wrote, and playing a poker game a couple of weeks later, he found it in his pocket and he threw it over in a wastebasket. One of the generals went over and said, maybe we should save this. But he wanted to have it ready. I mean, but it's reflective of the tremendous anxiety and the stakes. As he said, there's no alternate plan. It's planned for victory. If we'd have been thrown back into the ocean, it could have been another year and a half longer. I mean, the Holocaust would have gone on longer. Getting in would never have been a secret again. So it was a big deal. So there is a map here, I think, which shows the whole invasion route. And this is familiar to many of you before, and this is one that we use in the book. But we're talking here about the American forces. We're not looking at the British or the Canadians, and our museum is about the American experience in World War II. And so this gives you the scale and the complexity of that armada that's moving toward Normandy that night. And and we covered in the book, I cover the Omaha, Pointe du Hoc, Utah Beach, and the airborne and the naval stories in the major chapters. So this is the basic operation, but we're not going into the basic strategy here, being other than the big picture, except for my introductions.
Plenty of other historians have relied on oral histories, on the histories of people like the men in this room with us tonight. What about this book and the histories that you guys have taken is so special?
Well, first of all, it's what it's not. It's not a big narrative history like Ambrose or Bax Hastings or Rick Atkinson. I mean, it's not that. It's really about get out of the way of the stories of the veterans who were going ashore or parachuting into Normandy or on the ship. So it's but the unique feature of it is really it's a 24 hours. What I chose is to take out the best of our oral histories. And we have, as I said, 1,200, 1,500 just from D-Day. We use about 41 of them, and I extracted their transcripts of the oral histories they've given us, many out of Ambrose's original collection, from midnight to midnight. Now, sometimes I go a little bit before, I go beyond a little bit, but try to focus on those 24 hours. What they saw, what they felt, what they experienced. So it's a very sensory experience, but it's also very reflective as well in terms of after the battle and before. So it's that's, Rick Atkinson told me a few months ago, Cornelius Ryan figured that out back in the 50s, that the power of these personal stories was what he used for The Longest Day. Of course, he just took little snippets, a sentence or two here and there. And what I'm trying to do is let them take you all the way through the day. So you are really kind of going in their footsteps. And my job as a narrator to get you ready to do the introductions, to get you to the moment before they parachute in or get off the landing craft. So it's really a context setting and using maps that we developed that help make it unique. And we also have a website, ddaybook.com, that people can go to and hear the stories on video that we have in the museum that are curated. They can hear the whole oral history, not just the sections that we use. So And as I mentioned earlier, we have 150 some odd photographs, 90 images of artifacts. They surround these stories. So the weapons and the uniforms and the maps and the photographs are all there as you're walking through history through this dramatic day, this day of death and carnage and battle, and you see what they were seeing around them, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes this book special. So
I think that it's a tremendous, first of all, it's a little, reading the book is a bit like the experience of being at the museum. You know, you instantly feel a part of this, and I think you've done a really remarkable job in setting up the stories. It is not easy to take an incredibly complicated history and make it readable for people like me and the people in the room who are interested in it, who might be World War II buffs, but you make it digestible. So again, it's, you know, I read some of it in the car ride out here. I read a bunch of it last night and almost finished it in the car ride out here, and I'm driving out from Santa Monica, you know, so it's about a 6-hour drive. And I'm in the back of the car reading, and you got this driver I just met, and I'm, you know, weeping, which probably happens all the time out here to him, but nonetheless, I was conscious. So anyway, it's a wonderful, the way you've done it, Nick, is wonderful. So how do you get into the story of these 24 hours? Obviously, this is, you know, if you begin on June 5th, 1944, for the United States, the war is already more than 2.5 years old. How do you get into the story of this moment, this transformational moment in the war?
Well, I try to get you into the story right where you'd expect, right at the moments after midnight. So we start with the airborne, and so, I mean, this is an artistic rendering, but there were 900 C-47s flying shortly after midnight into the Cotentin Peninsula to drop the 101st 82nd Airborne. So my introduction gets you inside those planes and what they were thinking and praying or sleeping or whatever they were doing, and right before they're jumping out the door, and then once they get to the ground. So I'll leave the story when they get into action. And on the Navy side, 4:30, 5:30 in the morning, the naval barrage is beginning, and so you've got the stories of the guys on the ships as cover for the boats that are heading to the beaches, and then for the infantry getting off, when they jump off those boats right there, that's going in on Omaha Beach. Those guys are 18 years old. One of them said, June 6th, he said, I should have been at my senior prom tonight. So why are they there? What are they thinking? I mean, they're going into bloody Omaha right here, and the killing fields and the water, and they're dying, and their boats are being blown up. So you start reading their stories as soon as they go into action. And that is what we try to do, to let it go, get out of the way of the story of the guys who were on the ground. And then the photographs and the maps help you orient to where they say they were, whether it's Omaha or they're at St. Mary-Glise or Battle of Lafayette or Carentan or Pointe du Hoc. You have maps that and we'll show you some of those that help orient you.
The recall that these guys have in their stories is astounding, and not just recall of time and place, but recall of emotion, right? Recall of their degree of fear, their degree of not just fear of death, but fear of letting down the guy in front of them and the guy behind them. Historians are often dispassionate. I take it for Steve, when he was getting these oral histories, for you putting this together now, really impossible not to connect emotionally to these stories.
Yeah, and I think this is the face of the battle. Once it gets underway, I want you to feel and see what they're saying and what they're talking about. This is some of this is hard to see, hard to read. It's very unsparing. in terms of how they talk about the battle. There's a sense of shock. So you're going to have that sensory experience. This is combat history through the eyes of the combatants, Ben. I mean, this is not Bradley and the admirals that are looking through their binoculars 10 miles off the beaches. These guys are right there on the ground, and battles are on the ships. They're in the action. And so the sensory, the feelings, the reactions to what's happening, the noise, the fumes, the sound is all part of what you come away with as you read these stories, these overlapping stories of the same experiences on Omaha or a Point de Hoc. And there are moments of chaos, and there's moments of courage, and there's moments of fear, and there's the smell of death. And you are in their shoes. You are walking in their footsteps. And I hope the photographs and the maps help orient you to the scene that they're experiencing. But the drama and the tension is palpable. When you get ready to that moment where you're jumping out of the plane or getting off of the Higgins landing craft, I mean, this is where your heart starts to beat faster, because you know by the time they do that this guy or these stories are going to be rough to read. So we've picked stories that convey these kinds of images of soldiers living and dead, and you get the sense of their feelings and their most intimate thoughts right before they go into action and afterwards.
One of the things, Nick, that struck me both at the museum and in reading this book, and you can tell it from these pictures here, is that you talked about moments of fear, moments of anxiety, moments of courage. There's so many moments of randomness. I mean, where that is really what determined life and death. Whether if your landing craft got hit by a mortar shell, then you didn't make it.
Right.
And if it didn't, then you had a chance.
And they saw it next to them, in front of them, all around them. It was hell.
You have examples. Can you give us examples of the firsthand accounts of these 24 hours? I know you have a story from Hal Baumgarten. I read his story both last night and again today, because it is a story that stays with you, and you when you read it, you want to retain every detail.
Yeah. We'll jump past that. Eisenhower, just before talking to Wallace Strobel, before I get to Hal, you see the gun on his waist there. It was right before the airborne took off. Now, Eisenhower went to see him about 9 o'clock that night before they took off to cheer him on and to bolster their spirits, be sure they had their training. They were all cocky. Hitler, here we come. That's the way they were talking.
And I went to talk to him because he knew that the airborne was going to suffer horrific casualties.
Yeah, we think that Eisenhower, Sir Trafford Mallory, the air flight guy, he was against this. He said that they're going to be slaughtered. And Eisenhower made him put that in writing, and then he went ahead, because Bradley and Montgomery said, we've got to have the airborne behind Utah Beach. So that's the moment. And then we talked to people about, like Hal, who was, you were just mentioning, Hal Baumgarten, and some of our board members knew Hal. He just passed away a couple of years ago. Amazing guy. He was with us on June 6, 2000, when we opened the museum, with us on many tours, spoke at our conferences. And Hal is a 29th Infantry Division of the 116th Infantry Regiment. He went right into bloody Omaha. I mean, and on a landing craft just like the one you're seeing there on the screen. And he's a close friend of Stephen Ambrose and mine over 25 years. And he came back became a doctor and started trying to save lives. But he knew the story. He told the story well, and it's one of the most gripping stories. Just got a couple of minutes of it here, but it might be worth just looking at it and hear it from him rather than me tell you about it.
We started running across the beach. We were about 500 yards out. So we're neck deep in water. When we got to the actual beach, the sand was wet, and tide was treacherous. It went out fast and came in fast. Came in 1 inch a minute. So we hit the sand. We were running across sand at 300 yards out. So I landed. There's an artificial pier on that beach nowadays. It wasn't there on D-Day. I landed right where that artificial pier is, a little to the right of that one tank that was firing. So I was all the way on the western part of Dog-Green sector. The next beach over was called Charlie Beach. That's where the Rangers actually landed. They didn't land on Dog-Green. But anyway, there were a group of us running across the beach with our rifles at port arms, which is the rifle across your chest. When we got to about 135 yards away from the seawall, a machine gun spray came from the trenches up on the bluff. And I heard a loud thud on my right front, and my rifle vibrated. I turned it over. There was a clean hole through its receiver, which is a little rectangular plate in front of the trigger guard. My 7 bullets had stopped in the magazine section, had stopped the German bullet. Another thud behind me to the left, and that guy was gone too. I hit the sand behind the hedgehog, which is about 130 yards from the seawall. And I observed to my right Private Robert Dittmar, Fairfield, Connecticut. I was yelling. He tripped over the hedgehog, spun completely around, lying on his back and yelling, "I'm hit, I'm hit, Mom, Mother," and then he was silent. I looked over to my left, and Sergeant Clarence Robeson of Lynchburg, Virginia. I always mention their names and where they came from. I don't want people to forget about them. Clarence Robeson was staggering by me without his helmet, gaping hole in the left side of his forehead. His blonde hair was streaked with blood. I was yelling, "Get down." This used to be my nightmares. I'd be yelling, "Get down," because I never forgot that scene. And I guess he couldn't hear me anyway. The noise on that beach was horrendous. All these shells coming in, flamethrowers blowing up with the guys getting on fire. Noise was tremendous.
Well, so that's Hal's story, but he's wounded 3 times on D-Day, 2 more times on the 7th. He kept fighting despite his wounds. 5 wounds in a little over 24 hours, and that was the end of World War II for him, and he was evacuated out, but it's an amazing story.
He said, I think in his account, that he had 3 options. You either ceded the beach to the Germans, died, or fought wounded. And so he chose fought wounded. Yeah. Was Hal the one who put the Star of David on his back?
Yes, he was, and Steven Spielberg took that story in Private Ryan. There was one of the guys went ashore, had that Star of David on the back, and he took that from Hal, and Spielberg and Hanks both were connected to Ambrose and knew that story well when they were making Private Ryan.
So Hal was at Omaha Beach. What about other D-Day assaults? I know, and appropriate for being here at the Reagan Museum, you have a discussion of the assault at Pointe du Hoc, which technically exceeds the 24-hour rule, but it's understandable, and it was so important.
Yeah, that's one that went a little bit further than June 6th, and I'll tell you why. I mean, if you're looking at the screen right now, you see the point there, the dark shadow on as you're looking at it on the left side of the screen is where the boats went in, not on the right side of the point there. And that's Bud LaBelle in the picture. He was a sergeant at the time, and these Rangers were tough. They had to get to the top to get to the big guns. Their first mission was to get to these 655 millimeter guns from World War I that could hit Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, even closer to Utah Beach. It was critical to destroy those guns. So this was thought to be a suicide mission. But the Rangers were trained to the teeth by Big Jim Rudder, and We tell a little bit of Rudder's story. We don't have his oral history, but we have a lot of letters from his family and so forth. But we focus on Lamel because he was one of the first guys up the cliff. And then his looking for the guns and then his dash inland. And if you look all the way back to across those plains there, I'll show you in a map in a moment, a coastal road that was the second part of the mission. They had to go back and control that road. So if you want to look at the whole scene here, Point to Hawk is right there, a little bit to the left of the middle of what you're looking at. And the orange areas to the left and right are all the German defensive positions. And that dotted line that comes across the middle is the coastal road to Omaha Beach. And you can see to the left side of Point to Hawk, the big German installations there at Grand Camp. Well, what the strategists were worried about there is that if you didn't control that coastal road, the Germans could reinforce the fighting going on in the major invasion on Omaha Beach. So that's the sort of the big picture. And a lot of things went wrong. I mean, we'll give you an example now as a breakdown of just the point there. And up at the top right, you'll see the arrows coming in. Those are the landing craft and where they came up against those cliffs. And Omaha Beach is off 5 kilometers to the right there. And the red sections there are the Germans and the casements up on the point where the guns were supposed to be. And the bottom left down there are the German counterattacks. So the important thing is to understand here that once, and you heard in the introduction about the Rangers getting up the cliffs, but before they got to that point, everything went wrong. I mean, Rudder left the ships at 4 in the morning. 2 of his boats sunk within a few minutes after they started heading for shore. Then there was a navigation error, so they were way off course. Instead of being there at 6:30, they had to come back up against a fire from the shore, running the gauntlet back up to Point to Hawk. They got there at 7:10. There were reinforcements waiting offshore. He was supposed to send a signal for reinforcements to come in if they were up on top by 7 o'clock or 7:10. They were just getting up there, hitting the beach at 7:10. And then they get up there and you'll see those little red dots there. That's where the guns were supposed to be. Well, Lamel fought his way across. He got up, believe it or not, he made it up those cliffs with his company, D Company, in about 10 minutes against machine gun fire and grenades coming down. They got up and they raced across, fought their way across the top of the point, and all the guns were gone. They had big telephone poles sitting there to fool our aerial photography. So they went to the second mission, and you can see that horizontal line, kind of horizontal, about a little further halfway down the picture. That's where that coastal road was. So they raced back there. It's about 1 kilometer. And get control of the coastal road. That's what Lamel thought. So he did. He got his company. He said they took the perimeter, and then he started going down a little hedgerow. And you can see that on the left, that long that little white area, it's a double lane hedgerow. And I was there about 18 months ago, and I got a guide who'd never been there. Nobody goes there. It's on private land now because that's where he found the guns. The Germans weren't there. They were about 150 yards away in that bottom left area of the green area. That's where the Germans were talking.
150 yards.
Yards away, yeah. And the guns are sitting there by themselves. I mean, they spiked them with thermite grenades and got back and set up this perimeter.
And just Lamel and one other guy.
Yeah, Jack Kuhn, the 2 of them were they said the guns have got to be somewhere because they were not at the point. They knew they were there somewhere, and they just lucked into it, and they found them. And by 8:30, those 5 big guns were spiked and out of commission. And when I stood on that spot 18 months ago, it was a direct line of fire to Utah Beach from that spot. I mean, it would have destroyed the Utah Beach landings. I mean, it's just amazing. And so by 8:30, mission 1, getting the guns, was done. And number 2, they had established that perimeter, kind of an L-shaped perimeter of D Company, E Company, and F Company. And this is the interesting thing, is that I learned afresh. There were 2 fights, 2 battles going on for 2 days here. Rudder out on the point, you can see the red arrows, he was suffering counterattacks from the Germans at night, and Lamel at the coastal road was getting hit by the Germans in fierce hand-to-hand fighting in the hedgerows. It came right after midnight every night, and 2 separate battles. They couldn't even help each other, both of them trying to survive. And Captain Braun, who was with the 5th Rangers waiting offshore for the signal to come reinforcements, he had to go to Omaha Beach because he didn't get the signal. So the idea was then they'd get back on D-Day.
He didn't get the signal because the communications equipment got soaked with water. Right?
Yeah, got soaked with water, and they were also late to send the signal. So they diverted, and so Bud Lamel and his company, he had about 65. He ended up with 15 men after 2 days of fighting. But they held, he said, we never left the road. And they were hiding inside the hedgerows. The Germans overran their position a couple times at nighttime, but they never left. It was just one hell of a battle. So it's one of the interesting things you find out. And that map there is we recreated is off of the original after action map. So that was new to me, and the whole ending story of that. So it's one of the things you find out when you start doing a little research.
Some of the stories in the book, there are letters in the book from soldiers who clearly feared death and were open and honest about that, some of whom were in fact killed in action.
Yeah, it's not all happy endings here. I mean, you don't obviously have stories of people who don't survive, but you have letters and information about them before the invasion. And this was from Gordon Osland, who is the Coast Artillery Corps, and he is. This is a letter he wrote, and you can see the date there, I think, on it. It's June 3rd. It's a copy of the facsimile of that letter. He's writing to his wife, Chickie, on June 3rd, 3 days before the invasion. And it speaks to the values of these guys. And when you read their stories and their letters, you feel their values and their spirit. And he exudes a quiet confidence in this letter. And it's in the book. I'll just read you a little excerpt from it. It's very poignant. And he says, to my beautiful wife, Chickie, it's almost midnight on June 3rd. I want you to remember that date. I'm going to get my first real test as an officer very shortly, sweet. And I don't know exactly how I'll react to it. But at present, I'm very calm and not the least bit nervous. Chickie, when you get this letter, it will be old news, and you will know what the score is. Honey, I'm with a wonderful bunch of men, and they're all in the best of spirits, and morale is high. I love you, honey, and always will. And then he says, P.S. He says, by the way, I owe HJ $25. And if I don't make it, he says, you got to pay him, but don't do it if I'm okay. Well, sadly, he didn't make it. He was killed on D-Day. So it's a sad story, but it's reflective of much of what we know.
We want to make sure that we have time to get some questions. So I got one more for you, though, Nick. It's been 28 years since you and Steve had that first conversation in the gazebo. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
What's your main takeaway from D-Day as we get ready here for the 75th anniversary? You know, as we get older and older as a country, obviously more and more young Americans are separated from history. It seems far off. I work with a bunch of young people, many of them incredibly well-meaning, thoughtful, patriotic Americans, but they don't know, right? Because that's how things go. What should they know about it? What should they know about those men and those decisions?
Well, I think they should know what they were fighting for. They sure knew. When you read their stories, they knew they were fighting for freedom, democracy. I mean, Eisenhower said, you are about to embark on the Great Crusade. They're largely religious, the young men. And, you know, one of them, Walt Ehlers, who some of you know, his mother told him, you're a Christian soldier. So their values are are palpable when you read them. They knew why they were fighting. They knew that their nation was behind them, that their country was unified. And I hope people reading this will get a sense of those values, the spirit of America at that time. When you read their stories, their voices are authentic. There's no pretense about what they are saying. And they speak to the best of their generation, and they speak to us. And I think we can look back and say they answered the big questions for their generation and left us to the big questions for ours. And as we said earlier, could I have done it? Would I have done it? Can we unify our nation in the same way today? I think they'd want the memory of what they did to add meaning to our own lives. And I think that's the big takeaway, I think, for me and for this book after 28 years. And let me just end with where we began this evening, given the place that we are. There is President Reagan on June 6, 1984, with the Rangers that you talked about assembled all around him, and far off in the distance is Omaha Beach. And as one of his, of course, great and most memorable speeches, inspired Stephen Ambrose, inspired our whole nation, was an inspiration to me. And another quote from that speech, I think might be a fitting way to close. He says, "We're here to mark that day in history when the Allied armies joined in the battle to reclaim this continent for liberty. For 4 long years, much of Europe had been under a terrible shadow. Free nations had fallen. Jews cried out in the camps. Millions cried for its rescue. Here in Normandy, the rescue began. Here the Allies stood and fought against tyranny in a giant undertaking unparalleled in human history." So that's, I think, a lasting takeaway from all those 28 years.
Before we get to questions from the audience, you and Steve both thought World War II most consequential moment of the 20th century, right? Most consequential event, 6 years. Does that make June 6th, 1944 the most consequential day in 20th century history?
I think there's a good argument to be made for that. It was certainly the pivot point of the war in Europe, arguably the pivot point of World War II. If we had not prevailed that day, anything could have happened in Europe or the Pacific that would have gone against us. It was only after D-Day that the Allies really began to feel that we were on the march, that we were going to win. It was a matter of time. Eisenhower felt like, and he said this afterwards, it would have been a year or two setback if before we could have mounted another invasion. So, and I think it was also a turning point in the 20th century. Everything since D-Day, since World War II, was different from everything that preceded World War II for our country and for the values and policies and changes both at home and abroad by every president, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Carter, Reagan, almost all World War II, all of our World War II veterans up through Bush 41, all passing on the torch of liberty and all standing behind values Americans always had, but we put muscle into the defense and the advance of freedom and democracy around the world and human rights, and we stood behind those. And Reagan was one of the great presidents who did so. So yes, I think D-Day was a turning point, not just in the war, but probably in the 20th century.
We're going to take some questions from you guys. Some members of the museum staff are there with microphones, so hold your questions until then. Who's got a question for Nick? Right, that in the middle third row there. Hang on one sec, she's coming with a microphone. There we go.
Hi. I have been to the beaches at Normandy, and there's the same kind of feeling that you get at Culloden or Gettysburg. And it's a very heavy-duty place. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was, they were going to go in on the 5th, but they waited because of the weather and the pressure that was on the weatherman, and how Eisenhower had just such a short little time there to make that decision. It's like, do people realize how intense he had to be to make that decision and get the whole army moving?
Yeah, that was a huge decision on the night of the June 4th and 5th. Group Commander Stagg was the weatherman that had been reporting every day to Eisenhower for 6 months, so he gained a sense of reliability about his predictions. And it was he was predicting a front coming through, so the June 5th, they were already at sea. The invasion force had started moving for June 5th, and they decided, that based on the weather, to recall, stop the invasion, to postpone it one day. But they had to make the same decision again in the morning of June 5th. And Stagg came in and said he saw a little break in the weather that would, for 36 hours. Yeah, right. So there was going to be an opportunity. It wasn't going to be great, but the timing of they would have had to wait another couple of weeks, because they had to have low tide, the moon, the weather, everything going for them, because they wanted to attack on a low tide that was a rising tide, so the boats could back off of the beach in water, and the tides come in really fast there. So it was a very critical decision based on the weather, man, basically. And Ike had the decision, and his commanders were there, and he was pacing the floor. And
it was not unanimous.
No, it wasn't. It was kind of evenly divided. And we have in the museum that decision to go room where he had to make it, and he's the only man in the world that could make that decision at that time. And he knew everything was riding on it, and he just finally said, okay, let's go. Everybody cheered and ran out of the room and went to their commands.
And you're not being figurative there. Those were his words. Okay,
yeah,
let's go.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was he was the most powerful man in the world in that moment, and right after that moment, he was the least powerful man in the world. He couldn't do anything to change a single thing, and that's when he took the time to write that note that the whole invasion had failed.
Another question for Nick? There's one in the back there. We'll go back to the far last row and come over here.
Hello. I'm just curious, how long did it take to organize all the logistics needed for the invasion?
Well, it really started a couple years earlier. The original plan was the Cossack plan, and there were only 3 beaches planned for at first. That didn't get changed until January, when Eisenhower had been named Supreme Commander in December 7 of 43, and arrived in January. So they began, the last 6 months was very intensive, but a lot of work had been done for the year and a half before that. And so the logistics, they had millions of American troops were landing and coming into England. So all of England was a huge base, and all the ports around the United Kingdom and Ireland, everywhere was, so the supplies and logistics was just a formidable challenge to get everything, and not just for the invasion itself, but these supplies had to keep going, and built a pipeline under the English Channel to provide oil. So you couldn't just win the beaches. You had to keep pushing into Normandy. And so the supply issue is one of the big stories in the logistics of the whole invasion front. And it's not one that most people like to read about, because it's a lot of statistics and figures, but it was tremendously important.
And subterfuge was a big part of the planning too, right? Deception.
Yes, there was obviously secrecy was paramount. The whole Ghost Army that General Patton was given responsibility for, right opposite the Pas-de-Calais, because the Germans all had this impression that belief that the invasion was going to come wherever Patton was, and so this phony army with blow-up tanks, I mean, air blowed up, and phony installations and sound machines that made the sounds of tanks. Nobody could go near this big installation. They were turning spies. All the German spies in England had been turned. There were about 12 potential landing sites going over several thousand miles, all the way down to southern France and up to Norway, to try to convince the Germans through espionage and deception plans that the landings were going to come somewhere else. But most Germans believed. Even Rommel, who was the general in charge of the defenses in Normandy, believed that Pas-de-Calais was the shortest route across the channel. That's where it was going to happen. And Patton was located right behind the cliffs of Dover there, and they thought that was the marshalling area. So deception and secrecy was incredible. And right to the beginning of the invasion, they were dropping dummy paratroopers down in the little Ruperts, they called them, in a whole different sector to think that the invasion was coming there. So very, very elaborate. In fact, one of the guys that was in the Ghost Army became an exhibit designer later on in life, and he was the designer for our D-Day exhibit. So if you come to see the D-Day exhibit in the museum, you'll see that whole bodyguard of lies and deception plans there.
Another question for Nick, right there in the second row. Thank you.
Nick, I've been reading recently about General Butch Cota and his actions in getting off from underneath the seawall. Do you have some comments on his personal leadership?
Who, Cohen?
Cota, General.
Oh, Cota, yeah. Well, he was, Captain Ron was in there with the 5th Rangers. He tells a good story in the book, the 5th Rangers that went in alongside the 29th Division, and they were trying to figure out what they were doing in the hell that was going on there. And Cota was, Wade Ron describes it, this crazy man wandering up the beach, standing up while people are getting killed left and right about him, and Ron goes up to meet him, and Cota knew Ron's father, who was a general too, and he says, you Ron's son? Yes. Okay, so what the hell are you doing here talking to me? He says, Rangers lead the way, you got to get out of here. And so he went over and talked to Colonel Schneider, and they got the Bangalore torpedoes up there below the Omaha Bluff, blew up the wires and took off. And so I think John Ron, the 5th Ranger headquarters, as a result of the motivation of Cota, we're up there around noon on top of the bluffs, or 1 o'clock. It was an interesting, once you got through the barbed wire and got up, the Germans had a hard time because the machine guns and artillery were all triaged on the beaches in fixed positions. And so it was hell on the beaches, but if you got inside that, they couldn't, and Ron said, they couldn't direct their fire to the guys coming up between the big defensive positions. But Cota was instrumental in getting the leadership moving. And, everywhere officers had been killed, and so it was these guys on the ground had to take initiative. There was a lot of paralysis going on because so many were killed coming off of the Higgins landing craft. And companies were just a fraction of what they had. I think Baumgarten said there were only 2 out of his 30 men that made it to shore. So they were mixed up in units. They didn't have their lieutenants or captains, and Cota was a force there that morning.
I'm struck in reading the book, and I'm reminded then of Stephen's book of Citizen Soldiers and watching Band of Brothers, the enormous respect that the men had for Lieutenant and Captain Winters, Major Winters then. But who was the colonel leading the assault at the Pointe du Hoc also?
That was Colonel Big Jim Rudder.
Yeah, and same thing, like what comes through in these stories are when soldiers had a a commanding officer that they believed in, man, that is part of the story that they want to tell. You can really see in this the value of leadership at times of serious stress.
Yeah, and taking initiative. I mean, here's Sergeant LaBelle. He's a sergeant, and the guns are gone, and he knows exactly what he has to do, and he has to go in and take the coastal road, and he grabs some of his company, and they just fight their way out there right away. They don't wait around for the officer to tell them what to do next. So they were trained, they understood their missions on the ground, and didn't have to be an officer to take the initiative.
Another question for right there. Thank you.
Hi, my question is actually about the National World War II Museum itself. You're talking about all the exhibits, and the book itself was very interesting. I was wondering if you have ever had or have any plans to have like a traveling exhibit, much like the Vietnam War Memorial. The wall is traveling. Do you have any plans or have ever done that?
Yes, we do. We have a number of traveling exhibits. There's one traveling, it's really Louisiana focused. The Pelican State goes to war. We have Fighting for the Right to Fight, an African-American story of that's traveling the country right now. So we did one with in partnership with the Japanese American Museum that Pete Wilson introduced me to a number of years ago with the internment camps and that particular story. So these are small exhibits of about 2,000 square feet right now. We're going to be doing larger ones starting next fall. We have a larger space, about 4,000 square feet, so we'll be doing more. So we mount these exhibits. Sometimes we rent them ourselves, but the ones I'm talking about are ones that we have designed and fabricated, and we rent out at just a very modest fee plus shipping to other locations. But we're renting one now on the capture of Eichmann and his trial. That's going to open in October, and that'll be a very large one. And that's been traveling for 3 years. So yes, these traveling exhibits are great ways to get to different parts of the story of World War II, both on the home front as well as the war front.
Let me make a little pitch for your museum. How many people have been to the World War II Museum in New Orleans? Yeah, it's an amazingly immersive experience. It's just about the best museum I've ever been to, and one of the real qualities of the museum is its fearlessness. Obviously, when we're talking about total war, there's an ugliness to it. There are decisions that this country made that are regrettable now, and you guys don't shy away from examining that.
Right. I mean, for example, you go into the Road to Berlin exhibit, and the first thing you're in the deserts of North Africa, where our armies first fought, and Kazran Pass was a huge defeat. So we don't start. It's not an uninterrupted march to victory here. I mean, the setbacks, the mistakes, snafus. Sicily, when friendly fire, we shot down our own airborne guys going into Sicily. So we talk about the mistakes, the blunders, the green troops. We learned, though, one of the things I'm reminded again as you read, especially the guys on the ground, how fast they learned. They were well trained, but many of them were green to battle, had never fought before. First Division, yes, they were in North Africa, but others, this was their first combat. But how quickly they learned and understood how to make their way. You'll be impressed by that part as you read about it.
One more question for Nick before he goes up and signs some books. Let's go to the corner there. It's not the corner, the end.
Well, two of my favorite things, classic movies and
All right,
World War II
great.
history. Would you say, is there any movie that accurately displays World War II or D-Day?
Well, for D-Day, I'd have to go with Saving Private Ryan. The core of that story is correct. Ambrose loved it as well as the best of any World War II movie he'd ever seen. The soldiers carried their weapons right. They talked the right way. It was certainly the first 23 minutes of the attack. I mean, I sat next to Len Lamel at the premiere out here of Private Ryan, right next to me in the theater. And I asked him at the end of that, I said, how was it compared to what you went through? And he said, you'll probably never see anything on film as close to what it was like than you just saw. The only thing, the smell of cordite was missing, but he said it was pretty powerful. So there are other classics and other dimensions of the war in the Pacific or war in Europe, but Ryan is my favorite.
When I was a television reporter in 1998, I was a TV reporter before this job at TCM, and when Saving Private Ryan came out, I did a story with a Vietnam vet and a World War II vet. I saw the movie with them and talked to them afterwards, and neither of them had shared their experiences with their family like so many veterans. And these guys had never met, and they sat there together, and they cried together, and they listened to each other's stories, and the Vietnam vet couldn't believe that he had never talked to his daughters about what he had been through in Vietnam. And then this World War II vet who he was Jewish, and he'd been captured by the Germans. He escaped and got captured again. In the interim, he had taken the dog tags off of another dead soldier who didn't have a Jewish name, because he thought if he got caught again, he was still behind enemy lines. And then he escaped that time by his guard fell asleep and he killed him with a brick, you know. And here's this guy consoling this Vietnam veteran. So I agree that any movie that drew that reaction out of men who were not used to telling that story obviously touched something. I will say is not so much promotion, but for something I think people would enjoy on actually as part of this 2-month spotlight that we have every Thursday night starting next Thursday. And we got 75 movies in all, 27 of them hosted by me and various historians like Nick from the museum. On June 6th, on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, we have The Longest Day, which is documentary-like account of D-Day. It's nothing like Saving Private Ryan, but it's quite good. And then we follow that with a British movie called Overlord, which follows from 1975, which is one soldier from being drafted through his basic training until D-Day. And it's this tiny little 90-minute movie that stands really in contrast to the expansiveness of The Longest Day, and I think they're both well worth seeing. There are a lot of great war movies, but I agree with Nick. Saving Private Ryan wins, and Band of Brothers too on HBO. That wonderful, amazing 10-part series, class by
TV
itself.
series. Yeah.
Guys, Nick's going to be signing books upstairs. Thank you for coming and opening up this library to me and to Nick. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.